I think we're live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to my channel. For those new here, my name is Nikki, and you'll find me posting videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading, and now language learning as well as all the other things I love. And this is my new monthly series that I'm going to be doing for at least another year or so, I reckon, based on the topics I've got outlined so far. And it's looking at language learning. How do I learn languages? I've studied a few languages, which I'll be talking about in detail in some future videos, and just telling you, in the case of today's video, about some of the pitfalls you might come across in language learning, things that I've had trouble with myself, and some ideas on how you can get around them and how you can avoid these problems to begin with. However, today I am going to start off with a quick tag, which I came across online. I found it on, I think it was Lindy Boat's YouTube channel, but it was created by Ophelia Vet, and I've put a link to her video in the description below for you. So this is the Guilty Language Learner tag, which seemed to fit in reasonably well with the idea of learning pitfalls. So it's only got 5 questions, so let's have a little look at them. The first one is, which language do you never make time for? This is an interesting question for me personally, because I've just recently started trying really hard to improve some of my language studies. I took up Japanese and Korean fairly recently, and although I tried to keep up my previous languages before studying those, it had become a bit can't speak today. It had become a bit haphazard, and that was partly due to COVID, because there's issues with the mail. Letters are taking 6 months to arrive and things. So whereas I was practicing some of my older languages just from letter writing, even if nothing else, or perhaps a tiny bit of listening here and there, when I'm not receiving letters as promptly and can't reply as promptly, I was really lacking any chance to practice. So I am now, since the last couple of months, really trying hard to make time for all my languages during the week, which is quite an ask because I have a couple of jobs. I obviously look after the house, do all the cleaning, the cooking, clothes washing, all those kind of housewifey chores, if you like, without being a full-time housewife. And on top of all that, trying to study 8 languages a week is quite a thing, but I'm doing my best. To get back to the question, I would say the one I'd neglected the most prior to this was probably Icelandic. I started Icelandic, I don't know, probably about 2014 or so, I reckon. I did a few little bits of online study and things, and I went to visit Iceland in 2015, and I was able to get by just ordering food, just the basics, but without really being able to have a conversation with someone. And the issue I've always had with Icelandic is the lack of resources available, easily accessible resources, and the lack of opportunity to practice. I have a couple of friends in Iceland, but occasionally we exchange a letter, but it's not a regular thing. And I would find if I was only writing 1 or 2 letters a year, in that 6-month or something gap in between, I was forgetting quite a lot and almost having to start from, not quite scratch, but close to it each time I had to then write another letter. I can watch a tiny bit of Icelandic TV and stuff from here, but there's not as many easily accessible resources as there are for, say, French, Japanese, Korean, where there's tons of YouTube channels, tons of websites, podcasts, and everything available. So that's the one that I wouldn't say I never make time for it, but it's harder to make time for because it's harder to find ways in which to practice, I guess. After that long-winded answer, let's move on to number 2. Which language do you think you'll never learn? Look, the world's full of, thousands of languages. I certainly haven't got time to learn too many more. There's 1 or 2 I would kind of like to do in the future, but in terms of not ones I don't want to do, I would say I'm not particularly drawn to learning any African languages, but that's nothing against African languages. It's just that personally, I don't have a strong interest in anything Africa related that would prompt me to learn in the way that K-dramas prompted me to learn Korean, and anime and mangas prompted me to learn Japanese, and even Icelandic. That was because of Icelandic sagas and my interest in Vikings. So there's always been, apart from the ones that I had to learn at school, there's always been something that's prompted my initial interest. And so I'd say that the ones I've never learned are African, because unless something changes and something African culture like takes my interest, then maybe I would. But at the moment, I'd say the African ones are not really something that's on my radar. So number three, what's your most expensive slash least valuable language related investment? Um, Most expensive is going to be dictionaries and textbooks. The dictionaries in particular are always expensive, and actually, to be honest, the ones I'm using are the ones I've had probably for like 15 to 20 years in the case of German and French and Italian and that. They probably in many ways need updating, but I've put off doing so because they are so expensive, and because you can easily look things up on the internet these days. I'm tending just to stick with the books, but then if there's a word that's perhaps a more modern word, and I can look that up online. So I haven't replaced those. And a couple of my Icelandic actually textbooks, the few things that are available were quite expensive. I got one that was sort of $50, $60 for a single book. So those are probably the biggest money items. In terms of the least valuable, I'm guessing we're talking only in dollar terms. Valuable would be obviously using YouTube and other online free websites and resources. Would be the cheapest ones that I have. Number four, what's a lie you tell to non-language learners to try and get them to learn languages? I don't think I tell any lies. I mean, that's kind of why I've created this channel, really, or this series within my channel, I should say, just to talk about some of the things I do, what's worked for me, what hasn't, some of the problems I've encountered, just to try and help others. Because it's not that some people can learn languages and others can't. I think everyone can learn a language if they want to. Some people have a natural gift for picking things up, memorizing things quicker than others. So for some people, it might seem like they've got some sort of natural ability, but it's just that their style of learning, they found what works for them, and they're picking things up a bit quicker than someone else who's perhaps still needing to work out the best way to approach language learning for them. But I think everyone can do it. There's always good things and bad things. There's always the easy bits and the difficult bits. And I wouldn't try and lie to someone to get them to pick up a language, because if you lie and it doesn't work out the way they've been told, then they're just going to give up, and then nobody wins. And I'd rather encourage people while letting them know that these are the things you've got to watch out for. So number five, last question, what's your language learning guilty pleasure? I guess there's two for me. Since I've obviously started learning Korean because of K-dramas. K-dramas are a great pleasure for me. I like to sit down in the evenings. I have very busy days generally throughout the entire week. I don't really have a weekend day when I relax and do nothing. It's just full on all the time. But I do try to keep my evenings pretty much chill. So after dinner, once all the dishes and everything are done, I just sit down and I spend a bit of time watching K-dramas and then a bit of time reading. And I might do something while I watch K-dramas, like a bit of crochet or maybe write a letter or a pen pal or something like that. But essentially, that's my sit down and relax time. And I watch a complete range of K-dramas. Sometimes I like the more serious, like darker ones, but sometimes you just want a bit of fluff, and K-drama has some wonderful fluff. So that's probably my guilty pleasure. And the other one would be musical theatre, because I'm a huge musical theatre fan. So I love to listen to musicals in different languages and find the lyrics and sing along, and that's good practice at the same time. Though I will come back and talk more about music actually towards the end of this video. So that was the Guilty Language Learner tag. So moving on, I've got 5 things that I'd like to discuss in terms of language learning pitfalls. So we will move through them. Number 1, no plan. So I think one of the most difficult things in terms of learning a language is if you perhaps are new to language learning, or new to self-study language learning. So obviously, if you're taking a class, then you're being guided through things. But if you're self-studying, having no plan is potentially a problem. And this is one of those issues that I've encountered myself. So when I'm learning languages, I usually start, in the past, I've often started with the teach yourself textbooks, I have to say. I did that for Czech, Danish, and Icelandic. And I'd work my way through those books, and then I'd branch off and find other resources and go from there. I did it a bit differently with Japanese and Korean because I started both of those on Duolingo. And I hadn't used Duolingo before. And Duolingo, I mean, I could talk for a while about what is good and what's bad about Duolingo. It's not perfect. But to be honest, for learning Japanese and Korean, it taught me the alphabets, like hiragana, katakana in Japanese, and then the Hangul in Korean. It got those out the way first, helped me learn those. And although it's not perfect, it at least got me being able to say a few sentences just as I was starting out learning and starting to get a bit of an idea from the grammar. The thing with Duolingo, I said I wasn't going to dwell on it, but I will just mention this one thing in case people don't realize. If you use Duolingo on the app, you're actually missing out on a fair bit of content that you get on the website. And I mean, I feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, someone, but I don't think you can access all the grammar stuff from the app. I've never found a way to do it. But when you're using the website, if you log into the website rather than the app, there's often a grammar section associated with each unit. So you can read the grammar behind all the phrases they're teaching you, which I find really invaluable. And I actually, every now and again, I'll do a little bit of Duolingo on my phone on the app, but I prefer to use Duolingo on the website when I'm using it because of that reason. Excuse me, my throat's going again. It happens every single time I do one of these videos. So getting back to the point I was making, having no plan, I discovered was a bit of a problem for me with Japanese and Korean once I'd finished Duolingo. This is going to tie in actually with point 3 that I'm going to come to in a minute. But it was a matter of deciding where to go next. And I found myself not floundering completely, but I was practicing every day for Korean and Japanese. For the other languages that I'm just keeping going and keeping working on, I'm trying to do once a week at least for each of them. But Japanese and Korean, because they're my newest ones, I'm trying to do once a day, even if it's just 5 to 10 minutes of a bit of like a memorize or Duolingo or something, just something every day. And I found myself floundering around a bit, that I was studying, I was doing stuff, but I didn't feel I was making really any progress from where I'd been. And part of that was because I didn't really have a plan. I was just flicking from resource to resource and doing whatever. And there was no clear pathway in terms of improving. So that's something I'm working really hard on at the moment, to get some sort of plan in place, some small goals to work towards. And the trick with the goals is not to make them too huge and overreaching. Like, I want to be fluent in a year. Like, it's not really, I wouldn't say it's not achievable. I know people have done it, but it's difficult. And you'll do much better and you'll feel less stressed if you just set yourself smaller goals. Like, I want to learn 5 new words a week, or I want to learn 1 new grammar point a week. So that's what I'm working on really hard at the moment with my Japanese and Korean, is to start to get a bit of a formal plan in place for myself. Because having no plan, you can keep studying, you can keep learning stuff, you can keep throwing all this input at yourself, but it's hard to make it stick, and it's hard to really see how you're progressing because you don't have a clear path in mind. The opposite of that is actually point 2. And point 2 is burnout and over planning. So over planning relates in some ways into what I just mentioned about setting too high goals or setting too many goals. Like you say, I'm going to make sure I do 5 hours of study every week, but then it's hard to fit that in around your schedule. And then you start stressing and panicking because you're not meeting your goals. So you need to make them achievable. And it's better to set your goals somewhat under the time you think you've got to spare, to allow for eventualities. And then if it's a week when you have all the time you thought you'd have, then it's a bonus because you've done extra. So trying to over plan, and also over planning when we're talking about finding a pathway and making plans of what you're going to study, you can overdo that too. And you spend so much time planning and creating this beautiful like wall chart and all that kind of stuff that you're actually not doing any study because you're too busy deciding how you're going to study to actually sit down and do anything. So those are both aspects. And a similar thing I thought in some ways is burnout, when you're pushing yourself again so hard, trying to fit in so much that you get to the point where it's not sticking and you're exhausted and it stops being fun. And look, I've mentioned in another video previously already that language learning should be fun. Obviously, you know, if you're doing it for a school and you've got a compulsory course, then perhaps you're not a language fan and you have to do that. But for most of us that would be watching these kind of videos, we're all learning languages because we love language. And you don't want to ruin that feeling and that joy of language learning by pushing yourself so hard that it just becomes a chore and you dread having to do it every day. So that's another pitfall. And I think really between 1 and 2, you're just looking for that balance. You want to sit somewhere in between those 2 points and then you've got it perfect. So number 3, which I did touch on very briefly in something I said earlier, is resource overload. Now, this is definitely something that I have encountered myself this year, in fact, more than any other year this year. I found so many resources for Japanese and Korean online, websites, YouTube channels, and I was frantically saving them all. And then, as I said, for a little while, I kind of was just flicking between them, like not really committed to anything, just like jumping around all over the place, which wasn't very productive. So what I have now is, I think I did flash this at you on the screen last video, but I'll do so again. I have in my bullet journal, if I can find the right page. So yeah, I just went through and made a list of apps and websites to review for each language and like YouTube channels that I found for each language. And what I'm doing is taking them one at a time now, going through and looking at that resource, saying, what have they got available on here? Is it something that's valuable for me personally as a learner? If it is, then I'll keep it on the list and we'll gradually go through the list and work through it. But I found somewhere I bookmarked them initially, but when I look, it's like, oh, it's covering stuff I already know, or it's not really conducive to my style of learning, so I can take those off. And so my plan now really is to just take each of these resources one at a time, look at them. So for Japanese, for example, I absolutely adore the Japanese Amo with Misa channel here on YouTube. And I have spent the last few months going through every video she's posted from her earliest up to her latest. And I've now caught up. So she releases a video once a week or so, once every 1 to 2 weeks. So now I'll just watch them as she brings them out. And that's my aim with all these resources, is to kind of go back through, look at what's there already, what have I missed, get up to date, and then at least with the YouTube channels, I'll just watch when people put new videos out and take it from there. But resource overload is a problem, and it's not just Japanese and Korean, because since I decided to start working really seriously on my other languages again as well, I also did more resource I can't speak today, resource searches, and found again a ton of websites, ton of YouTube channels, and it becomes too much. And the basic answer is you can't do everything, or at least you can't do everything all at once. And some types of resource, like certain apps, certain websites, certain channels, are going to be an approach that suits you, and some aren't. So I think it's fine to go do a big search at the beginning, but then I think it's necessary to do what I'm doing now and just try to whittle them down to look at what's really going to work for you and what's not, and then to take things from there and just go with a few key resources that are going to help you move towards whatever small plans and goals you've set for yourself. So just watch out for that. It can become a little bit overwhelming, particularly for popular languages where there's just so much stuff out there. That moves us on to number 4, which is unequal coverage. And what I mean by this is coverage of the different aspects of language learning. Now, I am completely at fault in this myself, I have to say. If we think of the key areas as reading, writing, listening, speaking, and then grammar and vocab as sort of subsections of that, I am always much better at the passive side of things. So in all the languages that I've studied, my reading and my listening are always at a higher level than my writing, and a majorly higher level than my speaking. These days, there's not so much excuse for my speaking. There did used to be when we didn't have so many ways of practicing, but nowadays there are ways you can get around not knowing native speakers, like using websites like italki, which is something I'm looking at really seriously for myself at the moment, and I want to start creating a profile and really seeing what I can use that website for to help me on the speaking. But that is a pitfall for me in language learning, and it would be for others, that certain skills in the language are stronger than others. And it's about trying to make sure that you're doing a bit of everything regularly. So my aim, I'm just setting up my bullet journal ready for next year at the moment, and as we speak, kind of thing. And I am working on a spread because my aim is to cover those four: the reading, writing, speaking, listening. I want to cover each one in each language once a month. That's my aim, in one way or another. It doesn't have to be the same thing all the time, but and then grammar and vocab, a couple of times doing grammar, a couple of times doing vocab as well during the month. So that's my goal, and that's what I'm working towards. I'm going to start trying to get into a bit of a flow with that in the next few months, and then really push it from next year onwards. And that's an important factor, I think, because it's hard to decide. We're going to talk about fluency actually in my next video next month, in the October video, but so I won't dwell too much now. But it's an aspect of fluency, of deciding when you're fluent. Are you fluent when you can understand the language, or are you fluent when you can speak it, and things like that. And ideally you want to try and, you're always going to have the strong bits that you're stronger at than others. That's just life. But you want to try and get things as equal as possible in terms of your learning. And finally, point 5, isolation and bad habits. And this kind of ties into what I was just talking about, the speaking kind of thing, having someone to speak with and finding language exchange partners and things like that. But also, if you're self-studying rather than taking classes, then you're learning on your own. And the main issue there is, aside from whether you can practice all the different elements, is whether you're ingraining bad habits and incorrect language use, because you've got no one correcting you. And I find that difficult throughout. And I think, again, with all the apps nowadays and things like italki, HelloTalk, and things like that, where we can find language exchange partners who will correct our language for us, which is way better than in the past. Because I've always had foreign language pen pals, but one or two of them would send me corrections, but most of them wouldn't. So I wouldn't know if what I'd written them was actually correct, or if I was making the same mistakes again and again and again. And the trouble is, the more you make a mistake, the more that mistake's in your brain, and that's how you do it every single time. So it's just, I think, finding ways that you can be self-checking if you haven't got a teacher or classmates to do it for you. So obviously, the more contact you can have with native speakers, even if it is online and not in person, these days there's so many options out there for it, that there should be a way that you can show people your writing, practice your speaking, and get proper correction and advice. And that brings me actually to a final point that I wanted to make today, which I'm going to think of as a kind of bonus tip, if you like. And that is learning from music. Because learning from music can be wonderful. It's easy for us to remember song lyrics. I'm sure you've found yourself, like, you hear a song on the radio so many times and you realize you can sing along to it after a while. And so learning language from music can be really beneficial, because we do have the rhythm, the melody that helps our brain remember those phrases and words. The only issue is, and this is where the pitfall connection comes in, that song lyrics are not necessarily grammatically correct. They're also often informal language, and if you're learning a language where formality is a big factor, like something like Japanese, Korean, or even really German, and some of the other Romance languages, they have this sort of polite you and the informal you. But it's hard if you start learning phrases and then trying to use them from songs and you offend someone really badly, because the best example actually I can think of for this is Japanese. So Japanese song lyrics are not grammatically correct. And in addition to that, they use very informal language, and they often use words like kimi and nata, both of which mean you. But for those who study Japanese, you'll know that we don't really say you in Japanese when you address someone. It would be really rude, except in very clear circumstances. And in fact, if you want to look at some of these things with Japanese music, the site I mentioned, or the channel I mentioned earlier, Japanese Amma with Misa, She's done, I think, 3 or 4 breakdowns of anime songs in which she goes through all these points and she shows you where song lyrics can be understood, but you couldn't write it that way or say it that way in conversation or in like a formal document because it's not grammatically correct, and that you can only do that in a song lyric. So if you're learning for music, that's just a pitfall to watch out for, that you need to really understand where the song lyrics are deviating from grammatically correct language and from polite society appropriate language, so that you're not learning stuff that is going to get you into trouble if you try and say it to a stranger in the street, kind of thing. So that's just something that you need to be aware of when you're learning for music. But in other ways, learning for music is really great. And as I already told you earlier, I love to sing along to musical theatre songs as part of my language learning practice, just for fun, guilty pleasures. So it's absolutely great to do it, but just always keep in mind with music that there are these issues of things just not being how we would say them or write them in the language in other circumstances. So I think that brings us to the end of today's session. I will end there. I will be back again around the middle of October when I will do another video, and this one will be talking about fluency and the ideas of what is fluency, when are you fluent. It would probably be a slightly shorter video than this one. It's just something I wanted to cover that didn't fit naturally into it, another topic. So we will do that. After that, I think my next plan was to talk about some of my language learning habits that I've been using this year and how I'm adapting those for next year. And following on from that, I'm going to take each of my 8 languages individually and talk about my personal journey with them, including some of the resources that I've used and recommend, things that didn't work for me. And hopefully that will be of interest to those of you learning those languages. So I will end there for today. I'll be back again at the end of the month. In fact, I think I have a pre-scheduled video coming out next Sunday, which will be another tag. And then at the end of the month, I'll be doing my reading and film and TV wrap-ups as well for September. So I hope you will join me then. I'll close for now. Bye, everyone.